In 1906, Mexico tried to hold a barren atoll in the eastern Pacific by placing a small colony there. Families were sent to a ring of coral with little shade, almost no reliable fresh water, and complete dependence on supply ships from the mainland. When the Mexican Revolution disrupted those voyages, the colony was left behind. Hunger and scurvy followed. By 1917, the last survivors were women and children living under coercion on an island that had already killed nearly everyone else. Clipperton Island sits alone in the eastern Pacific, far from any settled coast. It is a coral atoll, low and narrow, with most of its land only a few meters above sea level. From a distance it does not look like a place where a community could persist. The ring of land encloses a lagoon. The island's only prominent rise is a rocky outcrop that was later used for a lighthouse. Even in simple geographic terms, it is exposed. There are no harbors in the ordinary sense, and landing through the surf has always been difficult. The physical conditions explain much of what later happened there. Clipperton's lagoon was not a dependable source of drinking water. Modern descriptions note that the enclosed water body was stagnant and unsuitable for ordinary settlement. The atoll itself was narrow, wind-beaten, and limited in what it could produce. Coconut palms existed, and there were seabirds in large numbers, but the place did not offer the stable resources of a normal island community. It was a reef that could be occupied, but not easily lived on. For governments and mapmakers, however, Clipperton held value beyond its appearance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, even a remote atoll could matter if it offered guano, strategic position, or a basis for legal possession. That was enough to turn an inhospitable place into a disputed possession. The island did not need to be comfortable. It only needed to be claimed, occupied, and defended long enough for the claim to look permanent. The dispute over Clipperton involved more than one country, but Mexico chose to make its claim tangible. In 1905, the Mexican government renegotiated arrangements connected to exploitation of the island's guano deposits. A year later it established a military garrison there and ordered the construction of a lighthouse. The purpose was clear. Continuous occupation would strengthen Mexico's case in its dispute with France over sovereignty. A flag alone was not enough. The state needed people on the ground. Captain Ramon Arnaud was appointed governor of the island. Contemporary summaries note that he spoke several languages and was considered useful in dealing with the competing international interests tied to Clipperton. He arrived as the official representative of Mexican authority. Around him a small colony began to form. Soldiers were stationed there. Workers came for the guano operation. Families followed. Children were born into a settlement that existed not because the island could sustain ordinary life, but because a distant government needed visible proof of possession. For a time, the arrangement worked in a limited way. By 1914, roughly 100 men, women, and children were living on the atoll, according to standard historical accounts. Supply vessels came from Acapulco at regular intervals, bringing flour, beans, tools, medicine, lamp oil, and correspondence. The colony was precarious from the beginning, but regular shipping made it possible. What Clipperton could not produce on its own, the mainland supplied. The reef did not become hospitable, but it became manageable. There is a temptation, looking back, to assume that everyone involved understood the risk in full. They likely understood some of it. The island was obviously remote. Landings were hazardous. Productive soil was scarce. Fresh provisions would always be limited. But systems built on routine often appear stronger than they are. As long as ships arrived, the colony could function. A lighthouse could operate. A commandant could keep records. Children could be raised in narrow domestic routines. Meals could be measured out. Work could continue. The settlement was never secure, but it developed the habits of security. This is what gave the later collapse its severity. The colony was not formed by shipwrecked strangers improvising from the first day. It was an organized outpost of a nation-state. Its members depended on schedules, authority, and supply. Their isolation was built into the design of the place, but that isolation had been masked by administration. Once the administrative system broke down, the colony was left with the island itself, and the island had very little to give back. The crisis did not begin on Clipperton. It began in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution disrupted the state's ability to maintain distant commitments, and a small colony on a remote atoll quickly slipped from priority. By 1914, regular resupply voyages had ceased. That interruption was decisive. The colony had been built on the assumption that relief would continue. Once that assumption failed, every activity on the island changed meaning. Fishing became not a supplement but a necessity. Coconuts became not a convenience but a ration. The reef became not a station but a trap. That same year, the schooner Nokomis was wrecked on Clipperton. Some of its crew eventually reached the Mexican coast for help, and later a ship returned to rescue the stranded sailors. Historical accounts report that the captain offered to take the colony's residents back to Acapulco as well. Ramon Arnaud refused. The usual explanation is that he believed a Mexican supply ship would soon arrive, and that abandoning the post would mean surrendering the island. It was a decision made inside the logic of duty and sovereignty, but it fixed the fate of everyone who remained. After that, the colony crossed into a different condition. It was no longer a military settlement awaiting delayed resupply. It was an isolated population with finite stores, weak agricultural prospects, and no reliable rescue schedule. The point of no return in many survival histories comes with a storm, a crash, or a wrong turn. On Clipperton, it came with a refusal and with the disappearance of routine. The mainland remained real, but practically inaccessible. The islanders were still under a flag, but no state was reaching them anymore. Once supplies ceased, survival on Clipperton became a matter of subtraction. Food stores diminished. Bodies weakened. Choices narrowed. The island offered fish from the reef, seabirds, eggs, and coconuts, but none of these were enough to sustain a community of that size indefinitely. Gardens had little chance in coral ground. The lagoon did not solve the water problem. Every successful day on the island simply postponed a larger failure. The first stage of such a decline is administrative. Rations are tightened. Duties are formalized. Waste is watched. People who once lived by schedules begin to live by inventories. The colony had men trained for military order and women accustomed to running households under restricted conditions, and that likely prolonged endurance. The lighthouse still had to be maintained. Domestic work still had to be done. Clothing had to be repaired. Children had to be supervised. Fires had to be kept. Fishing attempts had to continue even when returns were poor. Survival, in this phase, is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is a long sequence of adjustments made under worsening arithmetic. Historical summaries emphasize that scurvy became one of the principal killers. That is consistent with the colony's circumstances. A population cut off from regular fresh produce, dependent on dry goods, coconuts, and what could be gathered from the sea, would have had little defense against vitamin deficiency over time. Scurvy does not arrive as a single event. It accumulates. Weakness deepens. Gums bleed. Old injuries fail to heal. People become slower and less capable at exactly the moment when more labor is required from them. On Clipperton, this would have undermined every other survival task. The island also imposed a psychological system of its own. Its scale was small enough to prevent escape into distance, but large enough to maintain separation and hierarchy. People could not leave the colony's problems behind by walking away from them. The surf, the birds, the heat, the narrow strip of land, and the central lagoon repeated themselves every day. In many survival settings, a person can move toward a horizon. On Clipperton, movement usually brought a person back to the same reef. Repetition itself became part of the pressure. As conditions worsened, the colony's original purpose became less relevant than its physical limits. There was no longer a meaningful distinction between military and civilian suffering. A command structure may have remained on paper, but hunger tends to flatten institutions. The question was no longer how to hold an island for Mexico. It was how to preserve enough life to see another ship. Yet even that hope depended on strength that the island was slowly taking away. By 1917, almost all of the male inhabitants had died, many from scurvy. That fact matters not only because it marks the population's collapse, but because it changed the island's structure of authority. Male labor had sustained some of the hardest work. Male death also concentrated power in the hands of the few who remained physically able. One of them was the lighthouse keeper, Victoriano Alvarez. At first, he was simply part of the colony. Later, he would become the center of its final terror. Before that final stage, there was one last attempt to break the isolation. Historical accounts say that Ramon Arnaud and the remaining men who could still function launched a boat after sighting what they believed to be a passing ship. The attempt failed. Arnaud and the others were lost at sea. Sources do not preserve every detail with certainty, but the result is clear: the last effective male authority of the colony disappeared offshore. On the same day, a hurricane struck the island. These two events, taken together, ended the old colony completely. The hurricane mattered not just as weather but as a final mechanical blow. Structures already vulnerable on a low atoll would have been damaged or destroyed. Shelter would have become more fragile. Stored items could be lost. A storm on a mainland settlement can be followed by outside aid. On Clipperton it simply rearranged scarcity. Historical retellings place childbirth on the island during this period, which underlines the degree to which ordinary biological life continued inside extreme collapse. Even in a settlement stripped to its minimum, infants still had to be fed, carried, and protected. The practical burdens of care did not pause because resources had failed. From that point, the women and children who remained were surviving in a narrower sense than before. The earlier struggle had been against distance, exposure, and malnutrition. Now those pressures were joined by human coercion. Alvarez, left as the only adult man, controlled the only firearm and declared himself king of the island. The title sounds theatrical, but the underlying fact is simple. He had a weapon, and the others did not. On a place with no outside witness and no route of escape, that was enough. Daily life under such conditions would still have required ordinary acts. Food still had to be found. Children still had to be kept alive. Clothing still had to be patched. People still had to sleep and wake. This is one of the hardest features of long survival crises to understand from outside. Catastrophe does not replace routine. It degrades it. The women on Clipperton were not living in a continuous scene of visible crisis. They were moving through days in which labor, fear, hunger, and waiting coexisted. The island never stopped requiring practical work, even when its social order had broken down completely. Historical accounts describe Alvarez's rule as one of rape, violence, and murder. One woman and her daughter were killed after resisting him. The rest of the survivors lived under the threat that he could decide food, movement, and access by force. At that stage, the story of Clipperton ceased to be only a case of abandonment. It became a case of abandonment followed by predation inside isolation. There was no appeal and no external correction. The island had already removed the colony's defenses. Alvarez exploited what remained. By the time of the final crisis, the surviving group had been reduced to 4 women and 7 children. Among the women were Alicia Rovira Arnaud, the widow of Ramon Arnaud, and Terza Rendon, who later killed Alvarez. A public domain survivor photograph and standard historical summaries identify these names, though not every later retelling agrees on every minor detail. What is consistent is the broad structure: women and children endured the last period of occupation, and the end of Alvarez's control came from within that group, not from any official authority on the island. The time between 1915 and 1917 appears in most accounts as a blur of coercion and endurance. That is probably the only honest way to describe it. Long ordeals often leave uneven records. Some names survive. Some exact ages survive. Some dates survive. Inner states do not survive with the same precision. It is enough to say that the survivors lived in a condition where hunger had not ended, danger had become personal, and rescue had become uncertain enough to seem unreal. Their survival depended not on freedom of action, but on timing, concealment, and persistence. On July 18, 1917, Teresa Rendon killed Alvarez. Accounts differ in some details of the act itself, but all agree on its result. His rule ended before the day ended. Almost immediately afterward, a U.S. Navy vessel, USS Yorktown, reached Clipperton. The coincidence has often been emphasized because it is so stark, but it does not need embellishment. After years of abandonment, coercion, and attrition, the end came not through a planned operation or official relief mission from Mexico, but through a passing American warship arriving on the same day that the survivors eliminated the last man controlling them. USS Yorktown took the remaining survivors off the island on July 18, 1917. The last population of the colony consisted of 4 women and 7 children. Later retellings sometimes vary in how they classify one of the adolescent survivors, but the standard total is 11. The rescue did not restore the dead, solve the legal dispute over the island, or turn the preceding years into anything coherent. It simply ended the physical confinement. That is often what rescue means in severe survival histories. It is closure of exposure, not closure of experience. The women and children were taken away from a place that had begun as a state project and ended as an emptying ruin. There was no functioning colony left to evacuate. There were only survivors. Historical accounts note that they were transported to the Mexican mainland. By then, the original rationale for placing them on Clipperton had become irrelevant. The island had not been held in any meaningful human sense. It had simply consumed the settlement placed upon it. In 1931, the sovereignty dispute over Clipperton was settled in France's favor. That later ruling did not alter what had happened between 1906 and 1917, but it gave the story an additional irony. Mexico had tried to reinforce its claim through continuous occupation. The occupation failed catastrophically, and the territory did not remain Mexican in the end. The lives spent there did not secure the political outcome for which the colony had been established. Today Clipperton remains uninhabited. Scientists and expeditions visit, but no permanent population lives there. In that sense, the island returned to the condition that its geography had always suggested. It is a place that can be reached, studied, and named, but not easily turned into ordinary human space. Its history is not important because it is sensational. It is important because it shows how quickly state ambition can outrun environmental reality, and how a colony that appears administratively stable can collapse once distance interrupts supply. The Clipperton story also belongs to the history of survival in a stricter sense. It is not only a tale of political failure. It is a record of what human beings did when routine support disappeared and the environment offered too little margin for error. The most significant endurance on the island came at the end, when the formal colony was already gone and only the survivors remained. Their survival was not heroic in a theatrical sense. It was practical, exhausted, and incomplete. They endured long enough to be found. That was all. What remains is a pattern. First, a government treated a reef as a strategic possession. Then a community was placed there under the assumption that ships would continue to connect it to the world. When those ships stopped, the island reverted to its actual terms. It could not feed the people on it. It could not protect them. It could not preserve order. By the time rescue came in July 1917, Clipperton was no longer a colony in any meaningful sense. It was a remote atoll holding the last witnesses of its own failure.